Okay. So if we can get the slides up, I can start by saying that I will be reporting on Group C and hopefully if I have time for Group D. This was an interesting time for us to put this together. We have actually not come to a lot of consensus or agreement on exactly what it is that we're still in the process, in other words, of trying to refine what our recommendations would be. So this actually gave us a lot more time to interact and participate. So what I'm going to share with you is where we're at, some of the ideas that we still are looking for information on, and some particular questions. I'll try not to read the slides verbatim. So if you could advance to the next slide. For Group C, these are the 3 topics that we were asked to consider. And I will not read these to you at the moment. We'll go through each particular area as we come to it. So the next slide, we'll talk about our first topic, which was to enacting higher penalties for noncompliance and increasing the staff needed for enforcement. So while there has been some discussion on the effectiveness of fines, and whether or not they're very useful as a deterrent, there has been, I think, more consensus that fines do have a role to play. However, there's more question about when a fine would be determined. More clarity needs to be stated around when they begin and end. And there was an example given. So if a hospital is fined for noncompliance, why does the fine stop while they're in the middle of the CON process? And these are questions that we haven't, we know that this is true, but we haven't finalized our thoughts on. What was really interesting was that Dan Keenan actually brought us the model that works that is currently working in Massachusetts, which I believe came about because a hospital literally closed its doors one day and freaked out an entire community. But in Massachusetts, they actually separated the closure of essential services, including things like a hospital closing, from other CON requests, so as to develop 2 tracks where the closure of an essential service would require more in-depth understanding about the impact on the community, and the other requests, which tend to more be additional rather than closing, could go through a process that is a little more streamlined for that purposes. And we'd like to learn more about this approach and what works and what doesn't work, and how it might be interesting in the state of Connecticut to think about what's essential services from this point of view. The ACA has essential services, but they're across the boards and not necessarily hospital driven or healthcare facility driven. OHS has communicated to the committee that they are not adequately staffed for enforcement, that they feel that they are adequately staffed for the other components of their work, and they could use more resources for that purpose. And then I don't know why it's still on this particular version about oversight mandates. That's something that we actually eliminated. OHS has also communicated to us that it would be helpful to their work for the legislature to more clearly define a number of terms that have been thrown out at the meetings were inpatient, outpatient, transfer of ownership, but I'm sure there are other terms that would just help them be more clear in their work and actually provide more clarity in the process. Anybody from our committee want to comment on this topic?
Nancy, I could, this is Dan, I could just jump in and add a little bit of perspective specific to the essential services and one, but to thank you for your leadership of our group and coordinating us and making sure we stay on track. I think all of us appreciate that. And I did, as Nancy said, share the process that Massachusetts uses for discontinuation of services and, to kind of the extreme, a closure potentially of a hospital or the discontinuation of a service. So they have a separate process for that that's run, not part of in Mass, it's called determination of need. And there's a defined, by statute defined essential services and a very kind of regulated process to go through in terms of those services, similar to, Connecticut in terms of the process, but it is kind of a focus on that by the group within the state who's responsible for it. So that's all that group does, is focus on that. And, I just highlighted it's not perfect. And I think these are all challenging issues when you're talking about discontinuation of services. But I think the focus, it does highlight the focus of continuing to make sure that the needs of the community are met. And I do think that is an important part of this, not necessarily focusing on the service that's, being itself, but how do we make sure that the needs of that community are met? So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? I want to point out, I thought I had eliminated the second sentence in the third pair about having less oversight mandates on smaller requests. That was something that I misinterpreted and should be deleted from the slide. So sorry. Okay, so the second question, the Attorney General's authority to stop activities as a result of a certificate of need application or complaint. I think we were really greatly informed by Rose McGovern in particular about what the current role of the AG's office is in regards to OHS and its enforcement of CON orders. We didn't see we don't know of anything beyond that is specific to the CON process, but the group has considered questions and is interested in learning more, maybe even from the Office of the Attorney General, about if there are other roles that it feels that would have to be expanded by legislation. For example, in the case of a suspension or termination of services and its significant impact on racial and ethnic disparities was one of the questions, but there were a number of questions, and so I don't think we've come to any strong conclusion if there's an additional role for the Attorney General at this point. Anyone else from the committee like to speak to this slide? Okay, let's move on. Sorry, I'm going through this very quick. The ability of representatives of the workforce and the community to intervene or appeal decisions. This was probably the closest thing we've come to consensus on. We haven't seen or no one's proposed other models. So again, this could be opened up for discussion. Rose once again gave us a really good understanding of what the broad authority of the hearing officers to grant intervener status, what some of the questions are, and the different levels of intervener participation. And it seems that the process has been working well from their point of view. So while we are not closing the topic, it was the thing we came the closest to having some consensus on. Anyone want to jump in on this? Am I wrong on that? From the committee? Okay, we're just going very well. So now, are we all ready for the working group C? Oh, we're doing really quick. Yes. So we get the slides, Alex. Once again, the first slide will talk about the 3 questions that we've been answered. These are pretty meaty questions, so there's a lot more information that we're looking for and willing to learn more about. So, here we go. You can go to the second slide. You can see the 3 topics that we were charged with discussing and coming up with recommendations for. You can go to the next slide. So as you can see, there's a whole lot more questions here. So the question was changes to the Office of Health Strategies long-term statewide health plan to include an analysis of services and facilities and the impact of such services and facilities on equity and underserved populations. So the initial question was, should this happen? And what we did find out at our first meeting was that actually this has been authorized already, and that OHS had already been funded to contract with a firm to write this new healthcare facilities and service plan, and that plan will include an analysis on equity and underserved populations. We also found out that there will be a phase 2 where they're going to be looking for community input. So there may be members from this group or from the community that might want to participate in that second phase of that project. The firm is Altarium, and we did get a chance to see their Alterum, their RFP, but we have not had a chance because they haven't even signed on the dotted line yet, I think, to ask them more about the methodology, and that we would love to learn more about the methodology, what the expected deliverables, specific deliverables of this study are, and how they anticipate using that information and incorporating it into future CON applications and decisions. So that is something it was exciting to learn that the state had already moved forward on. Then there's lots of questions about that. And so there's ideas from, that are suggestions for discussion here around, what should be included in that. That's the last suggestion, making sure that it really is looking at the data and being realistic about the data that is collected. And I think now we'll be getting more data through the health information exchange data. And also the community needs assessment data has gotten, I think, a little bit more granular and can be used as part of this process. But one of the primary questions for discussions should be, so if applicants are now compelled because there's going to be a shortage of a service, or a service needs to be in a particular location because of an underserved or socially vulnerable population, how do we reconcile that with the need for the service to be financially viable? And if so, what role or support does the state then need to play in order to contribute to the sustainability or the insurance that these services continue to exist? Pat, I wanted to thank you for that particular question. I think we kind of went around it a lot and never actually said it out loud, I think, in our meetings. And so I think it's a great place for it to be right now. Can I have any comments on this particular slide? It's a big one.
I have a question.
Sure, Brenda.
This is going forward, correct, for any possible termination of services that goes against basic needs, healthcare need assessments and the vulnerable populations. What happens with the already healthcare deserts that are out there? And we didn't have this wording and this kind of clarity years back when this was happening. Is there any sort of repair possible?
So that would be part of, I guess, our discussion. We can, but I don't know if that's directly in our charge, but it could be something that comes out of our discussion. I'm excited to have these questions out loud and be able to have our next meeting to really think about it and to throw out ideas. John?
Yeah, that's a good question, Brenda. I think the gist of this slide is that the state OHS needs to have a plan, which they're working on, for all the services that need to be provided across the state, for vulnerable populations, but also for rural populations. How close together should service XYZ have to be? How far should people be expected to travel? It's going to be different for every service. And then the second half of that is, okay, if that is the case, considering cost and considering staffing and considering everything else, transportation needs of the people and all that kind of stuff, how do we make that as a state happen? So there is a lot here, but I think it gets at the gist of what one of the most important purposes of OHS, to provide for that kind of planning and stuff. And obviously staffing of OHS is critical here.
And Brenda, I just want to be clear, we pose this as a question, so there is no specific recommendation. And obviously this hasn't been put in regulation or legislation yet. I think we're learning the complexity of this. If you think of OHS's dual mandate, or it's probably more than dual, tri or quad, also have to maintain quality. So we're talking about the economics of establishing a service in an area where demand may be light, but they're underserved. But then we have to be concerned about sort of the maintaining proficiency in a particular service when the volume is light too, because currently one of the things that OHS looks at is the competence and capability of whoever the applicant is to perform high quality service. It's in their charge. So we're trying to figure out, how do you reconcile all of that? And I think it's very much a work in progress at this point. So we're trying to get various points of view on this. I hope that's a fair representation of the discussion we've been having.
I think so, and I think what's missing here, now that I'm looking at it, is innovation also, because there's not really only one way to provide services, and there are ways to look at delivery of services differently. And so thinking about that and thinking about how do we in this process, if the question isn't either or, but is there something in the middle or some other way of delivering services that works in other areas that can help bridge some of this issue? And I think I only work in a rural area. There is a lack of innovation on the part of a lot of organizations when they think about how to serve a rural area more effectively, and rather than just doing the same old, what they do in other communities. So most pilot projects are not done in rural areas, and therefore when they're duplicated or replicated in our areas, they don't work. And so I think that's part of the discussion here that we might be able to have. So anybody else would like to comment on this particular one? It's a big question. Okay, thank you. Let's move on. So this question of guaranteed local representation of communities on hospital boards. It was actually even a surprise to myself, and I thought I knew a lot about hospital boards. But the group did learn that some local hospitals don't have their own boards, but actually participate in a regional board. We did have a presentation from Jim Icabellis, I believe that's his name, from the Connecticut Hospital Association, who went into some detail about how some of these boards are self-perpetuating, where they're looking for different types of people to represent communities. And so I think there is consensus that those members of those boards need to represent and reflect the local population and be organized in such a way that it's welcoming to all. That's the DEI, or the approach to staffing or seating board members. But there are still questions and concerns that have come up in our meetings about the authority of local boards, local hospital boards, over strategic decisions that involve their hospital. So one way to better understand this has been suggested a couple of times, is maybe we could get a presentation on what the actual status is right now of the legal authority of hospital systems, multiple hospital systems boards, and what roles do they play at each level. And then again, maybe there's some innovation that can be had with local advisory boards or other things that might result in what it is that what we're I think has been the topic is how do we make sure that the voice of the community is represented at the local level for the local services provided. One question or one idea, would be to make the actual local hospital, or maybe it's regional. I'm not, I'm unfamiliar with those, be directly responsible for the required community needs assessment and its local implementation plan. So if they had some authority over that, maybe there would be, give them some control. It's just one of those questions that might come up, but what is it that we're trying to achieve, and how it actually happens, that there's local representation that's participating in the process of making decisions about that hospital.
Is that question, I'm sorry, is that question a recommendation?
The last question?
Yeah. About
It's not by the
it-
committee. No, it's something that's been talked about. And I know I've talked about it a long time, many times. But, and it may or may not even be feasible or useful, but it's one of those topics that I think would be easier to shift over into that community, into that role. So anyway, anyone have any questions or concerns?
Yeah, I think we talked about trying to get a greater understanding of what the current governance structures
Mhm.
are in the various hospitals and systems before we make anything a definitive recommendation in terms of how that might change. But this is one of those things that has surfaced a number of times that might find its way into a recommendation.
Yeah, and again, even thinking about it, what is the goal? So if the current structure doesn't actually help with that goal, there's some other innovation we can have to make sure that the community voice is participating somehow. So.
One of the things that we got to discussing at the end, I mean, there were certain understandings at the time a hospital decides to join a system, and its governing body, which is usually a board and a corporation that has many community representatives, has to approve that merger or to be acquired, and they know they're giving up some autonomy. So some of this should be perspective, and I think now that those decisions have been made, does something have to change in terms of how those organizations do business? So one would be for the few remaining that are left, if for whatever reason they decided they didn't want to be independent anymore, maybe there's some considerations that have to be made about, what part of local control is preserved when they give up their independence.
In the negotiations, yeah. Okay.
Not that any of us want to give up our independence, just for the record.
Any other comments on this? And maybe I have time to finish up the last one before I have to jump off. Okay, so the last question, again, another doozy, giving the Office of Health Strategy the authority to require ongoing investment to address community needs. And there's a lot on this slide, and we could go on a lot about this. I think this is one of the larger topics that the whole task force is interested in. I did quote you here, Pat. I think this is true. I do think that even amongst the hospital and everyone involved, that the hospitals in general need to do more than just count their government program underpayments as in regards to community benefit. I think we can all agree that it would just be easier also if there's more transparency, guidelines, and definitions about community benefits, so that we're comparing apples to apples and all understanding what it is that we're looking at. That was actually demonstrated by one of the further down points when we had a very good presentation by Brent Miller of OHS. He had done a multi-year analysis prior to COVID of all hospital community benefit spendings that have been reported on the IRS Form H in the 990. And it was clear there's a lot of variation amongst hospital, and it was also unclear, what they were using or what was included in some of those numbers. And so that just emphasized, I think, it would be the importance of transparency and setting guidelines and definitions, just to make it easier to compare. So as I stated, there is no real consensus in the group about what this looks like, or we haven't gotten that far into the conversation to think about guidelines and definitions either. Hospitals, while admitting that they have a role in improving the health and well-being of the communities they operate in, report that it would be very difficult to capture the value of some of their community work and to meet specific spending targets. There's also talk about how it would be different between different hospitals. Some hospitals have big endowments, some hospitals don't have big endowments. There's smaller communities, and what that would look like. Community advocates on the group, however, are also seeking more clarity and transparency about what is included, and are leaning more towards some fixed spending goal or guidelines that the hospital would follow in exchange for their nonprofit status. I think I've stated these positions pretty generally, accurately. Anybody want to comment at that point? Yeah. Okay. The last few bullets are really about, we were awaiting a report. We haven't gotten that on. There was proposed community benefit legislation last legislative session, just to get an idea really what that was about, and other questions involved, and what they were interested in looking at, and what was even the intent of this question. There's some suggestions that have come up in our conversations about strengthening OHS's oversight authority regarding the community needs assessments, and tying these needs assessment plans to their implementation plans, and maybe the resources spent on that could be something that's easily tied to the community benefit report. That might be a solution to some issues. Another would be to expand OHS's authority, now thinking about fairness and parity, to include all healthcare provider organizations, not just hospitals, in this, requiring some community benefits and cost containments, and basically to better address health equity across the state, rather than relying entirely on hospitals to provide that. So there's a lot here. Anybody have any questions? Because I do need to jump off in about 2 minutes. So
yeah, so let me just add to the last comment. It really is about leveling the playing field. Hospitals and health systems are just a portion of all healthcare providers in the state. And if we're truly looking to create a health plan statewide, talking about access and quality and experience, it really, if there are regulations and scrutiny, it needs to be equitably applied to all providers, whether they're backed by private equity, they're disruptors coming into the market, et cetera, because again, at the end of the day, hospital health systems are just a portion of the healthcare equation here.
Matt?
Yeah, did you have any specific, I understand sort of the larger question. Do you have a specific idea about how that would, what that would look like?
Well, so I also, as the group knows, I sit on the task force that is looking at physician practices and acquisitions of them. And so right now, those regulations only apply to hospital health systems. And so if others are acquiring hospital health systems, those regulations do need to apply to others. Otherwise, we just don't have a handle. There's no transparency, there's no information about those other providers outside of hospitals and health systems.
Okay.
So I need to sign off, but I can leave you guys to discuss more of this. I hope that I fairly, and you can close the slide. I hope I fairly captured input. I got a lot of emails up until late last night about what to include and not include. And I really appreciate everybody helping out and pulling this off, and we're meeting, I believe, in another couple of weeks again to further explore some of these issues.
And Nancy and Alex, I'm wondering if my recommendation would be on the slides to actually put the work group members on each, just so people know who's worked on which task force work group.
I can do that and send the updated one, especially with the line that I should have deleted that I thought I did. So.
Any other questions about working groups C and D?
I wanted to ask a question about, is there language in the certificate of need process about termination of services, whether they're inpatient, outpatient, but just termination of essential services? Because I know there's radiology, there's some equipment issues that are listed very clearly, but I didn't see anything that said about termination of essential services in Connecticut. So I just want to put that out there. And my last thing is just to note that in the last 30 days, in a less than 30-day window, 3 maternity units have been terminated, and there's a fight to reopen them. November 16th was Johnson Memorial. November 30th was Wyndham Hospital, and December 6th is Sharon Hospital. So this is a very important issue in terms of access and equity in the state of Connecticut. So it's a very real present issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Anything else for working groups C and D? If not, I think we skipped over, we didn't hear the recommendations of the last meeting on Wednesday from working group B. Is there anyone able to present on that? Alex, is that correct?
Yes, last meeting we had working group A. If B is not available today, then we can always have them another meeting.
John, were you raising your hand?
I was just going to say that in general, in our discussions, I have found the voice of people that work in OHS and the AG's office to be like invaluable. And I'm wondering at the end of this process, if if we come up with guidelines or goals of what we're looking for, like if we say we think that maybe there should be better community representation on boards, or maybe something about the length of time it takes to file for a certificate of need to a decision, and the fines involved in that, or whatever we decide the goals are. I think going back to OHS and the AG's office and saying, if this was what we were looking for you to do, what would you recommend to us that would be the fixes for it? I think that's going to be valuable. It's because it has helped a lot for me so far.
I think we're going to continue to get their input throughout the process, and then as we move towards the legislative phase to implement these recommendations, we're going to be leaning heavily on them as well. Is there anybody from Taskforce B on who's able to present? If not, we'll have to schedule that for a future meeting. Any other discussion before we talk about date and time of the next meeting?
I wanted to thank all of the members that have worked so hard on this, and the thoughtful conversation, and the recognition that we need to make change in Connecticut to make it a safer state for many people.
Thank you, Brenda. I think we all echo that, and these are big questions, and it was very impressive to see discussion from a variety of stakeholders, with very different points of view, and yet coming up with some really important questions and recommendations, and the 2 task forces we heard from today. So the subcommittees. So grateful to all of you, and appreciate your many hours of work and emails flying back and forth late last night. So Alex, do we have a time yet for a date for the next meetings? I think we would want to hear from the remaining subcommittees. And do we have a date yet?
There's nothing on the calendar yet.
Okay, but we'll send something out soon with that when we have more information about that. And we'll be in touch with you all. Okay, and with that, I think it's time to adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful weekend.